Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be responding to a content creator named Glen Scrivener, who made a 70-minute video about me. Now, right off the bat, I have to apologize for the length of this video. I have just hit record on this, and I already know this is going to be the longest video I've ever made, and hopefully the longest video I will ever have to make. But I do want to give you a little bit of background on what's going on here before we get rolling. A couple months ago, I made a video on the Trinity, and I used the analogy of an algebra problem to simplify understanding why the Trinity came to be what it is, and why there is what scholars refer to as the logical problem of the Trinity. And that video made a lot of people big mad, and I was repeatedly lectured about the notion that the Trinity was literally an algebra problem and how stupid that was. And all I could think of was Andy Samberg saying, "This ain't my dad, this is a cell phone," and obviously he had to throw it on the ground. A lot of people were trying to turn my analogy into far more of a load-bearing analogy than it was ever intended to be, so that they could have something to criticize about it. But shortly after that video came out, I got an email from Glen, and it was inviting me onto his podcast to talk with Dr. Joshua Sijuade, a specialist on the Trinity, about my video on the Trinity. And this is the response I sent to Glen. Hi Glen, thanks for reaching out. I would love to join you all to talk, but I'm going to have to ask for a bit of a rain check. I've got some specific family and academic responsibilities demanding all my time these days, and I've had to turn down all the invitations and requests I've been getting since December. If you're willing to circle back around closer to the end of the year, I'd be happy to get something on the schedule. I apologize for having to kick the can down the road a bit. I've sent this same email dozens of times over the last few months because I do not have a lot of time these days. I have had to turn down requests from close friends to go onto their podcast or to go live with them or things like that. So unfortunately, I just have not had a lot of time recently. And then 3 days later, I was tagged on YouTube in Glen's video. 10 tricks this scholar uses to deny the Trinity. And then the caption on the thumbnail says, "How does he miss it?" So I have finally gotten around to, one, watching the entire video, and two, setting aside the time to be able to respond to this video. So let's get into what Glen has to say about these 10 tricks that I use to deny the Trinity.
Dan McClellan is a scholar of the Bible, but he really does not like the Trinity. Here's how he characterizes it.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. Fundamentally, the Trinity is an attempt to construct a philosophically defensible framework that allows us to solve an algebra problem that we find in the Bible.
In this video, I'm going to show how Dr. Dan McClellan gets the Trinity so badly wrong, why the Trinity is not a maths problem, it is the good news that God is love and you're invited. And along the way, I'm going to highlight 10 different tricks that Dan McClellan has on display in these Trinity videos, but also more broadly in his work. He uses these tricks in lots of his videos, and it's just worth being aware of these sleights of hand. My name is Glen Scrivener from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. Why don't you give the channel a subscribe if you like talking about Bible and Jesus and God and how all these things make sense of life. So let's dive down into how and why Dan McClellan misunderstands the Trinity.
So before we get into the list of tricks, I just want to point out that in the opening 60 seconds of this video, Glen has already twice declared that I have gotten the Trinity wrong and accused me of using, not just in this video that I made, but in my general content creation, tricks and sleights of hand. And I don't care if Glen wants to do that in the first 60 seconds of his video. That's fine. As far as I'm concerned, that's fair play. However, this is precisely one of the tricks and sleights of hand of which he is going to accuse me. He's going to say that I poisoned the well by offering thesis statements at the beginning of videos. And he did the exact same thing at the beginning of this video. Once again, I don't actually think there's anything wrong with offering a thesis statement. I think that's how we do this. But in this video, Glen wants to try to turn that into something inappropriate, a trick, a sleight of hand that I try to get away with in my nefarious content creation. But let's take a look at this list of tricks of the trade.
And the first trick that we're going to be exploring from Dan McClellan is straw manning. It is to put the alternative position as rejectably as you possibly can, and then you take a flamethrower to that straw man and declare yourself to be the winner. This is how Dan McClellan characterizes Trinitarian theology.
Fundamentally, the Trinity is an attempt to construct a philosophically defensible framework that allows us to solve an algebra problem that we find in the Bible. And the fundamental problem is, how is it that Jesus can both not be God and also simultaneously be God?
I actually like that second sentence. That second sentence is actually what has driven Trinitarian theology, and it's perfectly understandable. Jesus is clearly presented as of God, and he is God. You can try desperately to explain away all the divine claims and actions of Jesus and to try to explain away why everybody was treating him as God in the Gospels or in the epistles. To reject the divine claims of Jesus, I think, is just an example of dogma over data. We'll get to dogma over data in a second, but he is of God in the Gospels, and he is God in the Gospels. As the Son of the Father, filled with the Spirit, he is bringing the name and the nature and the authority and the presence of God in all he does. That's essentially what the Gospels are all about. If you want to be reflective in any way about Jesus, then you will find yourself doing Trinitarian theology. Everybody has to do Trinitarian theology, whether they end up as an Orthodox Trinitarian or not. When you look at Jesus, you might think that, okay, Jesus is inferior to the one he calls God, and at that point you are called a subordinationist or an Arian, named after Arius the arch-heretic. You might look at Jesus and think that Jesus just is the absolute God who has descended to earth and taken flesh. At that point, you are what's called a Sabellian, named after Sabellius, a heretic who thought that, or a modalist, that really the three persons are just different modes of the one absolute God. You might look at Jesus and he says that he's been sent from the Father, and you might think of Jesus as a separate God, a separate and separable God from the Father, and that the Holy Spirit is likewise separate and separable, and at that stage we would call you a tritheist. Or you might think that Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, and at that point you are an Orthodox Trinitarian. But if you are at all interested in relating Jesus to the one he calls Father, then you are doing Trinitarian theology. You might be an Arian, you might be a modalist, you might be a tritheist, or you might be Orthodox, but you cannot escape Trinitarian theology. Not because everybody just loves to do maths problems. Trinitarian theology is inescapable for anyone who's wanting to answer the question, who is Jesus? So I do think that Dan McClellan is straw-manning the Trinitarian position. It's not an algebra problem where we have to solve for X. It is the existential problem that is thrust upon the human race when we deal with Jesus, who claims to be from the Father and is the great I Am. But that's trick number one, straw-manning.
So the problems with this attempt to accuse me of straw-manning the Trinity are legion. And the most fundamental one is that in absolutely no sense whatsoever am I straw-manning an argument, even if Glen is right. Because a straw-man fallacy is the misrepresentation of someone's argument or claim so that it can be more easily dispatched rather than engage the actual argument or claim. But I'm not responding to anybody's specific argument or claim. I am characterizing the historical development of the doctrine of the Trinity. So I'm not responding to an argument to begin with. So I can't be straw-manning an argument or a claim. So Glen could argue that my characterization is inaccurate, but that's not a straw-man fallacy. That would just be an inaccurate characterization of the historical development of the Trinity. And there are more problems. Glen doesn't actually demonstrate that I've gotten anything wrong here. I mentioned two things. He said the second thing I actually agree with. And then he went on to demonstrate the first thing was accurate as well, because he provided 4 different ways to solve for X within the analogy of the algebra problem that the Trinity is trying to solve. Whether it's Arianism or Sabellianism or tritheism or Orthodox Trinitarianism, those are all different ways to solve for X. In my analogy, solving for X is explaining in what sense Jesus is both God and not God. And Glen provided 4 different general explanations within the Trinitarian debates. Now, this brings up another thing. The notion that anybody who's engaging the question of Christology is engaged in Trinitarian theology is pure and utter nonsense. In absolutely no sense whatsoever is any attempt to understand Christology necessarily Trinitarianism. Trinitarianism is trying to understand how Jesus is God but is not the Father. My own work in Christology doesn't try to identify how Jesus is God. I'm trying to find out how it is that Jesus manifests God's presence. That's my primary concern. So, no, that's not Trinitarian theology. And this is something that's going to characterize pretty much everything Glen says in this video. He's not responding to me on the terms of my actual argument. Glen is performing for an audience that already agrees with him, which is why he goes into preaching rather than an argument. Because he didn't provide any argument here. He talked about how this is, the existential question that all humans have to engage, and begins preaching, which is not demonstrating that what I said is inaccurate. It's demonstrating that what I said disagrees with Glen's theology, with his dogmas. But pointing out that my academic approach to this disagrees with your dogmas is not actually demonstrating there's anything wrong with my academic argument from an academic point of view. This is just preaching to the choir and acting as if you've done something. But you've not done anything here. You've shown that you don't understand what a straw man fallacy is, and you've demonstrated that you're not going to be engaging my work on my terms. You're going to be demanding that my work satisfy your dogmatic terms. So we're already off to a very bad start, but it gets even worse because my argument about the development of the Trinity as an algebra problem is actually very closely related to what Dr. Joshua Sijuwade has said about the logical problem of the Trinity. And if you'll recall, Dr. Joshua Sijuwade is the expert that Glen wanted to bring on to teach me a thing or two about the Trinity. This is Glen's ringer. And let's take a look at what Dr. Sijuwade has said about the logical problem of the Trinity. So in this paper, The Logical Problem of the Trinity, A New Solution, Dr. Sijuwade tries to offer a new way to do what I characterized as solving for x. Now, in this paper, this is metaphysics that Dr. Sijuwade is engaging with. And so it's not characterized as an algebra problem. It's characterized as a problem of logic. But here in the red box at the bottom, we get this characterization of the Athanasian Creed, the 7 main claims of the Athanasian Creed, and then an identity reading, which he refers to as IR, where he says 1 star, the Father equals God, 2 star, the Son equals God, 3 star, the Spirit equals God, 4 star, the Father does not equal the Son, 5 star, the Father does not equal the Spirit, 6 star, the Spirit does not equal the Son, 7 star, there is exactly one God. Now, before we continue, I want to remind you of what my argument was. I said, let A equal the Father, B equal the Son, C equal the Spirit, and G equal God. A plus B plus C equals G. A equals G. B equals G. C equals G. A does not equal B. A does not equal C. B does not equal C. And so what I was trying to point out is that we have this sense of is not and this sense of is. And somehow we've got to integrate the two. There's got to be a way that Jesus is both God and not the Father. And the Spirit is both God and not the Father or the Son. And we've got to find a way to integrate is and is not. And that's where we always have remainders when we drill down to the bedrock of the problem of the Trinity. So let's go back to Dr. Sijuwade's discussion. The standard interpretation of AC, that is Athanasian Creed, provided by IR, that is the identity reading, takes there to be first solely one God within the Trinitarian life, and second, the copula is featured in AC is taken to be that of a numerical identity relation, equal, which results in each of the three hypostases, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, being numerically identical to the one God. Given this specific reading of AC, it is quite clear that a proponent of this reading would face a logical incoherence challenge, which has been termed the logical problem of the Trinity, LPT. Specifically, the LPT can be raised against the consistency of elements 1 star through 7 star of IR on two fronts. First, by the is featured in 1 star through 3 star being that of a numerical identity relation, then by the transitivity of identity, i.e. if x equals y and y equals z, then x equals z. The Father would be identical to the Son, and the Father and the Son would also be identical to the Spirit, which would thus render 4 star, 5 star, and 6 star as inconsistent. Let us call this issue the distinction issue. Second, as 1 star through 6 star takes each of the members of the Trinity to be numerically distinct entities that are each God, and as 7 star takes there to be only one God, there seems to be an inconsistent affirmation of there being exactly one God and also more than one God within the Trinitarian life. Let us call this issue the oneness issue. So taking these two issues together, it seems as if 1 star through 7 star are inconsistent statements, and thus one or more of these statements must go. However, as each of these statements or elements is required to be held by a proponent of the doctrine of the Trinity, one cannot simply jettison any of these statements. Rather, the task for one who holds to this specific reading of AC is either for them to defend IR by showing the distinction and oneness issues to not really be problematic, or for them to provide an alternative reading of AC in a way that wards off the distinction and oneness issues, without, however, transgressing the boundaries set by AC. So this is a philosophical equation. And I characterized it as an algebra equation. And what I was talking about with solving for x is integrating the oneness and the distinction issues. What is the framework? What is the reasoning that allows 1 star through 7 star, according to Dr. Sijuwade's formulation of this problem, to be consistent, to be coherent? So Dr. Sijuwade is not representing this as an algebra problem. This is a philosophical problem. This is a logical problem. I am representing it as an algebra problem. To suggest that Dr. Sijuwade is right and I am wrong is laughable on the very face of it. We're just characterizing the same concern in two different ways. Now, Dr. Sijuwade thinks he has the right solution. Whether it is the right solution or not is not something I can address in this video. It's something that's going to be determined by time and by consensus. Does it become the solution that people repeatedly appeal to? Does it become the answer to the logical problem of the Trinity? Probably not. But people have been arguing about this for a long time. In fact, the logical problem of the Trinity goes back decades. Here's Cartwright's discussion of the logical problem of the Trinity from the 80s. We can go look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the Trinity and look at the table of contents, and these are all different resolutions to the algebra problem. They're grouped into 4 different categories: 1 self theories, 3 self theories, 4 self, no self, and indeterminate self theories, Mysterianism, and then within those categories you got a bunch of different resolutions. But this is all different ways that people have solved for x. So my use of the analogy of an algebra problem to describe in a more accessible, simple way what's going on with the Trinity is perfectly accurate. This is not a straw man at all. One, because I'm not addressing an argument. I'm characterizing the historical development of the Trinity, but also because it's what Glen's own expert says, just in different terms. He's talking about logic, I'm talking about math. It's just an analogy, and it is accurate. It works. This is something that scholars have been talking about for a long, long time, and there is no consensus view on which resolution to x is correct. And we can see all kinds of other engagement with the problem. Recently, this book was published, One God, Three Persons, Four Views, a biblical, theological, and philosophical dialogue on the doctrine of the Trinity. And what were they arguing about? Mainly how to solve the logical problem of the Trinity. We've got this volume, Philosophical and Theological Essays on the Trinity, published by Oxford a while ago, and we can look at the abstract on Oxford's website. Classical Christian orthodoxy insists that God is triune. There is only one God, but there are three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are somehow of one substance with one another. But what does this doctrine mean? How can we coherently believe that there is only one God if we also believe that there are three divine persons? This problem, sometimes called the threeness-oneness problem or the logical problem of the Trinity, is the focus of this interdisciplinary volume. There was a whole volume of Theologica, an international journal for philosophy of religion and philosophical theology, that was committed to the problem of the Trinity. There was a doctoral dissertation at Notre Dame by Bo Branson called The Logical Problem of the Trinity. There have been other attempts to solve the logical problem of the Trinity. Here's another one by Bo Branson shortly after his doctoral dissertation. And a lot of the volumes that are addressing the Trinity, this Oxford volume, Christian Philosophical Theology, this Cambridge Elements volume, The Trinity by Scott Williams, this other Oxford volume, Metaphysics and the Tripersonal God, are focused in large part on the logical problem of the Trinity. So, the attempt to characterize my video as straw manning falls so laughably flat on so many different fronts. And this is not a good way to start off a video where you're going to demonstrate that I'm the one who doesn't know what's going on. But now let's get to the trick, the sleight of hand, that Glen himself committed at the beginning of this video.
But as Dan addresses the issue of why Christians embrace Trinitarian theology, we'll observe trick number 2, poisoning the well. Let's see what Dan says.
There are two reasons that when we tried to construct this philosophically defensible framework, we ran into internal contradictions that we just couldn't resolve. No matter how far down we dug, once we hit bedrock, there was stuff left over. There were questions that were raised by the process that could not be resolved. The first is that we approached the Bible with the presupposition of univocality, that it all had to be speaking with one single unified and consistent voice and from one single unified and consistent perspective. And so the authors had to be made to be agreeing with each other. They could not be representing different perspectives on the nature and the relationship of God and Jesus.
Okay, in a second we will discuss specifically what univocality is particularly, but for now, let's just notice the broader trick that's called poisoning the well. Sometimes poisoning the well in debate is about framing a person as unworthy of your trust in advance of them actually telling you anything. So you can poison the well by making somebody mistrust a person before they've even had the chance to learn from them. But you can not just poison the well as regards a person, you can poison the well as regards a concept or a philosophical idea or a posture or a position that somebody might take. You can cast that position in such negative terms that basically the person, even before they've actually considered taking that position, just says, oh gosh, well, I can never draw from that well. Maybe it's stupid to believe in this case that the Bible underneath it all is a unified whole or something like that. You know, if Dan says boo hiss enough to the unity of the Bible and gives it a term like univocality and maybe even puts some scare quotes around it, then it makes that idea sound naive or nuts or nasty or low status or imbecilic. And so then I'm going to be very reticent to actually go anywhere near something that might sound like univocality. The well has been poisoned, as it were, and you can see why Dan might want to poison that well, because as soon as you take the Bible seriously as a whole, you might start to become a Trinitarian. You might start to see that John's vision of who God is from the beginning is indeed the correct vision, that Jesus is indeed Lord, and that the New Testament is actually a correct assessment of what the Hebrew Bible has always been saying. Actually, if you start to see the unity of the Bible, you'll become a Trinitarian pretty quickly. And so it's very important to poison this well. If you think John is right about Genesis, then you must conclude that in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Son of the Father, who was in the bosom of the Father, and that no one has ever seen God the Father, but God the Son has always been the one making him known. And as soon as you start to see Jesus as Lord in that sense, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, you're basically a hop, skip, and a jump from being a Trinitarian, and we can't have that. So you need to poison that well. This trick number 2, poisoning the well, is very much like straw manning, but it's very strategically deployed. It's a preemptive strike against a position that is very important for Trinitarians to hold. But if in advance I'm afraid of ever looking for or affirming the unity of the Bible, then the anti-Trinitarians win. That's the usefulness of poisoning the well.
So, in absolutely no sense whatsoever, was that clip that Glen played an example of poisoning the well, and for a few different reasons. But the main one is that I wasn't poisoning the well. I wasn't saying univocality is wrong. In that clip, I was just observing that one of the things that governed the development of the Trinity was the presupposition of univocality. And so if there's an argument that I'm making here, it is that univocality was presupposed. No argument was provided for univocality. And in fact, Glen provides absolutely no argument for univocality. And you'll recall in the previous segment, I pointed out that he's not engaging on academic terms. He is sharing dogmas that he knows his audience shares with him. And so the starting point is those dogmas. And really what Glen is doing is contrasting my academic position with those dogmas. And so anybody who holds those dogmas is going to be like, yeah, he's wrong because of the dogmas. So for me to say, hey, when they were doing this, they were presupposing univocality, is an observation that I have repeatedly demonstrated on my channel over the last several years. And Glen does not engage in any kind of argumentation for his position that the Bible is unified. So I've not poisoned the well in any sense whatsoever, but also it's not poisoning the well to provide a thesis statement, as I've already stated. If it is, then Glen's whole video has been poisoning the well, because all he's doing is asserting conclusions and dogmas and not providing any actual argumentation. And the title of his video and the thumbnail caption and the way he introduced the video in the first 60 seconds of the video were all asserting conclusions, poisoning the well, according to Glen's inadequate understanding of what it means to poison the well. So, yeah, trick number 2 just falls flat as well, and Glen doesn't know what it means to poison the well.
But let's dive down into this specific issue of univocality. I think this is trick number 3 that Dan uses. He'll disparage the unity of Scripture. Let's hear him say it again.
That it all had to be speaking with one single unified and consistent voice and from one single unified and consistent perspective.
And at this point, we want to say, I don't know, man. I mean, everybody is dealing with multiplicity and unity at all times. Every kind of study, you need to mark out the domain of your inquiry, and you're going to draw a line around stuff, and you're going to say, this stuff belongs within the circle, and other stuff does not belong within the circle, and there's going to be a multiplicity of things that is within the unity that you've already defined. Everybody's dealing with multiplicity and unity, and especially in the realm of biblical studies, what is the Bible, right? Why these particular books? And even if you say, well, I don't treat them canonically, I don't treat them as exceptional documents, well, you've still got a speciality. Why ancient Near Eastern tribes and languages and cultures and not other? Like, you're going to see certain kinds of unity and you're going to see certain kinds of multiplicity. Everybody's involved in unity and multiplicity.
And this has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with univocality or the presupposition of univocality. Glen seems to be talking about biases. Yes, I am biased towards studying ancient West Asian literature rather than ancient East Asian literature. That's a bias, sure. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with my research, but it also has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with what I have always and quite explicitly meant when I have talked about the presupposition of univocality. This is utterly irrelevant. This is entirely a non sequitur that has absolutely no relevance to what I'm talking about.
Now, it's true that Christians see a certain kind of unity. We see that Jesus is Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, and that the New Testament is basically correct about its assessment about how the New Testament belongs to the Old Testament and how both witness to Christ. Okay, that is a unity that Christians believe in, but we also believe in a heck of a lot of multiplicity. The voices across the whole canon of Scripture that testify to this truth testify to it in so many different ways. I mean, just check out how the name of the Lord is declared in Scripture as one who is abounding in hesed and emet, grace and truth. It gets declared in Exodus 34, and then it's taken up by and voiced differently in Exodus and Numbers and Nehemiah and Psalms and Joel and Jonah. And then in John chapter 1, we've got this Greek-speaking guy, John, who is like delivering to us this same truth, but from a very different perspective and a different language with a whole bunch of different conceptuality, but there's a unity, like the Lord is appearing and he is abounding in hesed and emet, in grace and truth, karatos and aletheos, right? Here is an incredible unity, but also incredible diversity. And there are polyphonous voices that are singing in harmony with one another, and we do think that there's a harmony, but univocality is just a straw man poisoning of the well to make us not look for and not accept when we see unity. But Christians really do believe in diversity and polyphony, actually, when it comes to it. And notice how in John chapter 1, he feels free to use a term that the Old Testament never uses. He uses this Greek word, monogenes, right?
So the Hebrew Bible doesn't use any Greek words because it's written in Hebrew and a little bit in Aramaic. It's not written in Greek. However, if we go look at the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, monogenes actually occurs more times in that translation than it occurs in the New Testament.
Jesus is the one and only, the monogenes, from the Father, full of grace and truth. It's a word that was used by Middle Platonists, and it was used by Philo, for instance, as, the Word of God, the Logos, is the one and only Son, this monogenes.
No, Philo never once uses the word monogenes in reference to the Logos. He uses protogenes, firstborn, but never monogenes.
And John feels able to use a different kind of conceptuality, really, to describe the same reality. And Christians have no problem with that. John is using a philosophical Greek term in the first century that was not used by Moses or Isaiah, right? And that's cool. Christians are absolutely fine with that. We believe there's a rich diversity in these library of texts. The language of Moses is different and very significantly different to the language of David, which is very significantly different to the language of Isaiah, very significantly different to the language of John. The God who John is describing is the God who Isaiah was describing, is the God who Moses is describing. And we don't insist that if Moses was truly a believer in the Son of God, he should have used the word monogenes. We don't insist that Moses should have used a word that only John used. But neither do we say that Moses must have used homoousion to patri, right? That he must use the Nicene formulations in order to have something like a Christian doctrine of God. We don't think that at all. Nicaea used language like ousia and hypostasis because they were dealing with a certain heretic who'd been duped by a certain philosophical system into denying Christ in his true deity. So they used those philosophical terms, but no Christian insists that John needed to use those same philosophical terms, or Isaiah or Moses. Now, expecting that kind of univocality would be foolish, don't you think? And yet, Dan McClellan wants to insist that if John was anything like Trinitarian, he ought to use the language of the 4th century in the 1st century. Now, if you ask me, that would be a really silly univocality to expect. And yet, that's precisely the univocality that Dan McClellan expects.
This is an absolutely laughable straw man fallacy. And now I see where Glen's going with this. My concern is with the presupposition that the biblical texts cannot disagree with each other. I don't care what words are being used. I don't care about lexical or literary or linguistic or syntactical or grammatical variation or consistency. That is not what I talk about when I talk about univocality. My concern is with whether or not the texts are allowed to disagree. And Glen here has made clear that he is presupposing univocality in that sense. And instead of trying to generate any kind of argument for the reasonableness of the presupposition of that univocality, he's misrepresenting me as insisting on lexical, literary, linguistic, syntactical, grammatical consistency across the board, which is absolutely asinine. I have never made any such argument whatsoever. I have always pointed out it's not the words that are at issue. It's the conceptual frameworks that are being indexed by the words. Are they allowed to disagree? And by suggesting that I'm demanding lexical consistency, Glen is trying to lay a rhetorical snare. Because later on down the road, he's going to suggest that I am saying John is not a Trinitarian because he doesn't use the Trinitarian words. So here, in this segment, Glen is saying, look at that. Dan demands they use the same words. But we believe in multiplicity, polyphonous voices. So Dan's expectation is not what Christians believe. And that's the straw man, because the multiplicity of terms, the polyphonous voices, are utterly irrelevant to my concern for univocality. But Glen has to misrepresent me because down the road he's going to say John doesn't use the Trinitarian words, and that's why Dan says John's not a Trinitarian. And that's entirely false. I have repeatedly, consistently pointed out that it's not about the words. It's about the conceptual frameworks that the words are indexing. And a variety of different words can index similar or even close to identical conceptual frameworks. So it's not about the words. Glen needs to make it about the words because he's going to straw man my argument about whether or not the author of the Gospel of John could be talking about the Trinity. He's going to straw man that as well, just like he's straw man my concerns about univocality here, because he doesn't have the first clue what he's talking about.
And all of this comes as part of a ploy to disparage Scripture's unity. And I just think you don't need to. You can let the Scriptures testify to themselves with this multiplicity of voices, and the headline story is not actually the fracture and the dissolution and the disunity of biblical voices. I think the headline story, and it's a remarkable story, is that there is a deeper unity across the centuries, across the cultures. And it's a unity that really does come together when the Word becomes flesh in John chapter 1, which we'll get to in just a moment. But that's trick number 3, to disparage the unity of the Scriptures.
So you'll notice that Glen never once actually engaged my concern. He certainly never made a case for the unity of Scripture. He talked about it as something that we should just agree with. And then he misrepresented my concern as something totally unrelated to what my actual concern is. So this is another straw man, and Glen is doing what I said. I said they're presupposing univocality when the doctrine of the Trinity is being developed. And Glen here is accusing me of disparaging the unity of Scripture. Not because he can demonstrate the unity of Scripture, but just because he's presupposing it. And he knows his audience is presupposing it. And so if he can say, look at him, he's disparaging the thing we all already agree on, then he doesn't have to make a case for why it's rational that we all agree on this one thing. He's just whipping the audience into a dogmatic fury by pointing out that I disagree with something they are presupposing without argument. He's presupposing the univocality of Scripture as well, but he has to misrepresent me in order to lay this rhetorical snare that is going to spring later on down the road.
Here's trick number 4, chronological snobbery. Dan thinks that not only does John's Gospel not really know how to put Jesus and God together, not only does the 4th century Council of Nicaea not know how to put Jesus and God together, but that for millennia we haven't really been able to understand how Jesus and God fit together because we've been ignorant of cognitive science. Here's what he says.
The tools we brought to the issue were the canonical philosophical frameworks of the day, and they were inadequate to resolve an issue that arose as a result of intuitions about deity, about agency, about personhood. Intuitions that we wouldn't be able to adequately interrogate for over 1,000 years. But we couldn't just scrap it and start over with a new approach because we had imperial and institutional leaders breathing down our necks.
We'll get to the imperial powers in a second, but just notice for now the chronological snobbery of what's going on. John, though he was writing about the Word who was with God and was God, he can write those things, but he couldn't properly understand what he was writing about, and certainly the Nicene Trinitarians didn't understand what they were saying, and we had to wait for the development of cognitive science in order to understand personhood, etc. Now, that's in contradiction to what John chapter 1 verse 9 says, the true light who enlightens everyone was coming into the world. The Bible says that there has been a moment of enlightenment. That moment happened at the Incarnation. It happened in the 1st century. And I guess we're forced with a question about whether Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment scientific tools have been the real source of enlightenment in this world, or whether Jesus himself has been the true source of enlightenment in this world. And people are free to take off the Jesus lenses and put on other lenses and read the scriptures and read reality through the perspective of evolutionary psychology or sociology or Jungian archetypes. People are very free to wear those lenses and see if life makes more sense that way, to see if scripture makes more sense that way. But I do feel like we've been running the experiment for a very long time now, and I think the most fruitful view of the scriptures and the most fruitful view of life has been to see things through the lens of Jesus. But we're tracking with the signature moves of Dan McClellan. Trick number 1 is straw manning. Trick number 2 is poisoning the well. Trick number 3 is disparage the unity of scripture. Trick number 4 is chronological snobbery.
And you can dismiss that expertise despite not having expertise of your own as chronological snobbery when you perceive that it serves the interests of your identity politics about which you are not thinking critically here and now.
That brings us to trick number 5, the halo effect. Perhaps you know about the halo effect. It's where an expert in one field is considered to be an expert in all fields, whether or not they have expertise, because their authority or their sense of authority bleeds over into other domains. Now, I am paying a compliment to Dr. McClellan by saying he might be subject to a halo effect. I am not subject to a halo effect. There's no chance of me having a halo effect because I'm not an expert in anything. I have no expertise to call from in order to pretend to an authority in a different domain. I have no expertise anywhere. Dan McClellan does indeed have expertise in the realm of biblical scholarship, and I find myself learning a great deal when I hear him talking about the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East and ancient cultures, ancient literature, Second Temple Judaism, and he has some real expertise in the cognitive sciences and their application to biblical studies. I don't always go where he goes with that stuff, but I can recognize expertise when I see it. Having said all that, Dan McClellan is not, as far as I am aware, a scholar of early church history or patristics, theology, Christology.
So this is incorrect. I am an expert on early Christology. This has been part of my academic specialization for many years now. In fact, the first thing I ever published in a peer-reviewed critical academic venue was this paper, Cognitive Perspectives on Early Christology, in a 2017 volume of biblical interpretation, and this was based on research I was doing for my doctoral dissertation. Now, my second master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation were focused on conceptualizations of deity and divine agency in the Hebrew Bible, but that research was also intended to then go on and apply similar frameworks to the New Testament and early Christianity to see what we could find out about how early Christians understood not just God, but the relationship of Jesus to God. And so when I published my doctoral dissertation in revised form as an open access academic monograph, I included an appendix that discussed the applicability of the theoretical framework I developed in the book to early Christology, and that will be the topic of the next academic monograph that I write, and I've got a couple papers coming out in edited volumes later this year based on more research into Christology and the applicability of the theoretical framework I developed in my doctoral dissertation to the question of early Christology. So I am a specialist in that. Now, that doesn't make me a specialist in early church history or patristics, but it does mean that I have to engage with those specializations. And every scholar has to engage in tangential and other specializations in order to try to supplement the work they're doing more directly in their specialization. So I engage those things. I'm not a specialist in patristics or church history or anything like that, but I can engage competently with them. And hopefully, as I've made clear in this video, I do rather understand what was going on with the development of the concept of the Trinity, and it doesn't seem that Glen really understands what's been going on with the scholarship there, because, as I've pointed out, he's appealing to a scholar who actually agrees with me, where Glen says that I'm wrong. And that scholar is a specialist in these things, or at least is a specialist in the development of the Trinity.
Which is fine. I'm not an expert in those areas either. I mean, they are a great passion for me, but I'm not an expert in those things. But I think it would be a mistake to allow Dr. McClelland's expertise in one area to provide a halo effect for all his other pronouncements. But I do fear that that's happening because when he tries to articulate the doctrine of the Trinity in a way that's recognizable to either early Christians or modern Christians, it rings incredibly hollow. And when he tries to tell a story about the road to Nicaea in 325, I just hear a lot of caricature that is unworthy, really, of a scholar. Here he is explaining why he thinks the Trinity held sway in Nicaea in 325.
So we had an emperor come flying in off the top rope to smash that subscribe button once we had some kind of answer. And he said, sign on the dotted line or you're going to be exiled. It was imperial and institutional power that enforced a fundamentally inadequate explanation for what was going on in the Bible. And ever since, it has been institutional power that has been there to enforce the Trinity and say, this is what we believe, and you just have to accept it.
I mean, that just doesn't describe history fairly, I don't think.
I think it describes history very fairly. I just think that folks who are dogmatically committed to the doctrine of the Trinity as an eternal revealed truth are made a little uncomfortable by acknowledging that imperial force and authority played a role in its establishment.
And I don't think it describes what was motivating those theologians and missionaries, those bishops in 325?
Well, I would say two things here. One, this is a rose-colored perspective on the motivations of those bishops, but the other thing I would say is that I never mentioned the motivations of bishops. I talked about the mechanism for the enforcement of the conclusion they arrived at. That's distinct from talking about their motivations for coming up with the doctrine of the Trinity.
I'm very much hoping to have Dr. Josh Siawadi on the channel to talk about early church history and the theological and scriptural road that led us to Nicaea. So please do subscribe so that you can catch that one. But just briefly, in 325 AD, there was a council called the Council of Nicaea, and they hammered out some language that was at times quite philosophical, because they wanted to counter a heretic called Arius. Arius came along and said, I know who Jesus is. Jesus is great. He's exalted. He's just not as God is God. And Arius said, think about it. Jesus is the Son of God. And have you ever met a son who is equally old with his father? Of course not. There must have been a time when the son was not. And Arius was a great social media influencer. He could have been a great content creator. He probably would have been a public scholar with a big YouTube channel. And he even got people singing songs. There was a time when the son was not.
I hope you could see that the point there was to say, I am the arch heretic. I am the Arian. It's all just unbearably clever. But we're going back to using preaching and sermonizing as a proxy for an actual argument. But because this is about the motivations of bishops and theologians and not about what I actually said in that clip, which was about the demonstrable and objective reality that imperial power played a determinative role in the enforcement of the outcome of the Council of Nicaea, I'm going to skip over that.
Here's trick number 6, the appearance of neutrality. Do you notice what t-shirt Dan is wearing here? Data over Dogma. It's also the name of the podcast that he's a co-host of. It's a cool slogan. It's a nice t-shirt. But Dan knows, I'm sure, that it's not as simple as the slogan makes out. The data and our hypothesis that explains the data, aka the dogma, right? The data and the dogma, they exist in a kind of dance, right? We are not neutral before we come to the data. And there are dogmatic convictions that are shaping us and that are directing us towards investigating certain data over other bits of data. Convictions that shape how we assess the data and sift the data and synthesize the data. Dogma and data are in a kind of a dance together. But as we turn to our second video, I think we'll notice that there is a pre-existing framework of interpretation that Dan is kind of living with. And that dogma lives loudly within Dan McClellan. Dogma is not simply the end result of synthesizing the data. Dogma acts like a pair of lenses, and sometimes those lenses just don't help us to see. And you can present all the data in the world to someone with the wrong lenses on, and they just won't see it.
So this is obviously true. This is something I've talked about many times on my channel. This is something that I research as a specialist in cognitive linguistics and the cognitive science of religion. This is about how our intuitive cognition, our conditioning, and the social identities that are important to us influence how we are able to perceive and interpret the world around us and the data that we're looking at. And Glen's video is a wonderful illustration of precisely what he's talking about. No matter how much data I throw at Glen related to something like univocality, he's not going to see it. And we can just look at the video and observe that Glen has provided no argumentation. Glen has provided no data to counter anything that I've shared here. All Glen has done is asserted dogmas and preached and sermonized as a proxy for an argument because he knows his audience will eat that up, and that's all they need in order to feel like the argument has been won. But Glen has provided no argumentation. In his segment about the unity of the Bible, he just presupposed univocality, wildly misunderstood and misrepresented how I have always and consistently approached univocality because he needs that misrepresentation as rhetorical leverage for a point he's going to make later on down the road. But the notion that critical scholarship is dogmatic to the same degree that Glen and other apologists are dogmatic is absolutely laughable, because there will always be that epistemological gap between how the world actually is and how we're able to perceive and access and interpret it. We can't really get around that. But a long-standing kind of standard apologetic piece of misinformation is the notion that that epistemological gap makes critical methods and theories and standards equally as dogmatic as apologetic methods and standards, that there's somehow parity regarding the dogma. And this is just laughable, because one of the main differences is when it comes to critical scholarship, we're always willing to revise and update and supersede and abandon methodologies when the data demonstrate that there are better methods and theories out there, because that gap's not going away. We are always only ever able to do our best, which is never going to entirely close that gap. But that doesn't mean that all attempts to try to close that gap are equally as dogmatic, because on the apologetic side of things, you're not trying to close the gap, you're trying to defend your dogmas, which are not open to scrutiny. Because I can throw as much data as I want at Glen regarding the fact that the Bible is not univocal. Glen will never see it. We saw in his segment about deriding or questioning the unity of Scripture that he provided no argumentation whatsoever and entirely misunderstood and misrepresented what univocality is. All he did was use preaching and sermonizing about univocality as a proxy for an argument because he's preaching to the choir. He knows his audience already agrees with him, so he doesn't actually have to provide any data. He doesn't have to provide an argument because all they want is to be made to feel like they're winning. And ginning up that collective effervescence of conservative Christian identity politics is close enough to the sense of winning the argument to suffice. That's why it's a proxy. So Glen cannot engage the data. Glen cannot provide any argumentation. Glen is just performing for an audience who shares these dogmas with him that are not subjected to scrutiny. My approach is always subjected to scrutiny. And it is open to it, and if someone demonstrates that there's a better approach out there, critical scholars, overwhelmingly, nobody's perfect, but overwhelmingly, critical scholars will be willing to change. I have demonstrated many times on my channel that I'm open to being proven wrong, and I'm willing to go out and acknowledge it, and then move forward with a better understanding, whether that's better methods or theories or conclusions or what. And I have changed my mind about things that I have felt strongly about regarding the interpretation of the Bible. I have demonstrated that many times over. So while Glen is trying to generate a sense of kind of dogmatic parity between critical scholarship and apologetics, it is profoundly misguided, and it is a laughable attempt to say they're just as dogmatic as us, so our dogma's okay. The reality is that Glen is significantly more dogmatic than I am and significantly less willing to subject the biases that he has to scrutiny.
I think we'll see that when we see Dan McClellan reacting to a video by Dan Patterson, the Australian Christian and apologist. Dan Patterson's video was a reaction to an earlier Dan McClellan video about Jesus not being God in John's Gospel. So here is the video entitled, "Did I Misread John?" And it begins as a perfect example of the seventh trick that I think Dan McClellan uses, which is always be confident.
Am I wrong about Jesus in the Gospel of John? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and at least one content creator seems to think so. Let's take a look. Jesus is not God in the Gospel of John, and no, not even in John 10:30. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and
I'm wrong on this one. At least that's the basic consensus of Johannine scholars, who say Jesus does claim to be God in John's Gospel.
that's certainly a possibility. I don't think that it is the general consensus of Johannine scholars that Jesus claims to be God in the Gospel of John. Certainly it's a representative position, probably even a majority position. I don't know that it goes so far as being a consensus, though. But I am working on a large-scale state-of-the-field biblical studies survey that will be able to give me some hard data as soon as it's complete. So pending on that one. But even if it is a majority view or even a consensus view, I still don't think it makes much sense. And I'm going to explain exactly why in this video.
So notice how Dan McClellan is expressing a minority opinion in this video, but I think what we'll see as we go through the video is that Dan McClellan is as sure as he is in any video, whether he's in a majority or a minority, whether it's a very marginal view or whether it's a very well-attested view, Dan McClellan seems to always be confident. In fact, we'll see that Dan can get very forthright indeed, even though his view is a minority opinion. Trick 7, always be confident. But when that confidence is not always indexed to the certainty of your position, I think we have reason to be suspicious.
So I'm kind of at a loss regarding this one because I don't think there's actually anything wrong with being confident. I don't think there's anything wrong with the fact that Glen is speaking down to me about my academic specialization from a position of no academic specialization. That's his prerogative. I'm not going to play tone police. And I don't think that being confident about a conclusion that I have arrived at after years and years of research and study is some kind of sleight of hand. This sounds more like tone policing than anything else. But he's moving on to something. Let's see where he's going with this.
Trick number 8, misquote your interlocutor. Here's what Dan Patterson says, and then we'll see how Dan McClellan misquotes him, I think, and then misinterprets him.
Certainly John believed Jesus was God.
All right, let's see it.
The first 3 verses of John's opening prologue speak of Jesus' pre-existence as the Logos, being God alongside God in the beginning and creating everything.
So 2 concerns here, and let's start with the one that's easier to dispatch. John 1:3 does not say that all things were created by the Logos. It very clearly says all things were created via, through the Logos. And the overwhelming scholarly consensus is that that preposition indicates the Logos is a secondary agent of creation. The Logos is not the originator, the governing agent of creation. It is the instrument of, or the intermediary, or the secondary agent of creation. God the Father is the originating, governing agent of creation. The Logos is the means by which God the Father created all things. So the text quite explicitly says all things were created through the Logos, which is different from saying all things were created by the Logos. So the content creator, to the degree they are insisting that the text says the Logos created all things, is demonstrably in error there.
Now, if you go back, you'll notice that Dan Patterson does not use the word by. He doesn't use the word through either. He does say that Jesus, the Word, is described as creating everything, which is demonstrably true.
Not necessarily. I think you could say it is true that John 1:3 describes the Logos as creating everything, as long as you understand that participial phrase there to refer to just having some kind of participatory role in creation, and you do not understand it to mean that the Logos is the very agent of creation. And it doesn't seem to me that that's how Patterson is using that participial phrase, because he's leveraging that idea as evidence that the author of the Gospel of John clearly believes that the Logos is God. And so that would mean that Patterson is presupposing that the Logos' role in creation identifies the Logos as God. And I think that that requires you understand the Logos to be the very creator, the governing agent of creation. That is not what is in John 1:3. And in that clip that was just played, where I responded to Patterson, I pointed out to the degree that this is what Patterson is saying, that's demonstrably false. So I was leaving the door open to him meaning something different, him meaning the Logos is creating everything just in the sense of having a participatory role in creation. I don't think that's what Patterson meant, though. Because, as you're going to go on to point out, having a role in creation puts the Logos, Jesus, on the creator side of the creator-creature dichotomy, which is Baucham's theory of divine identity Christology, which basically means that to be on the creator side of the dichotomy is to be God, is to be the creator. And this glosses over this important distinction that I was highlighting, because throughout the entire New Testament, and even in early Christian literature after the New Testament, there is a distinction that is drawn between the Logos and the creator. Because every time Jesus is mentioned in reference to a role in creation in the New Testament, Jesus is never the creator. Jesus is always the instrument or the means of creation. Creation always happens through Jesus. It is never by Jesus. And this distinction between Jesus as Logos and the Creator is maintained even decades after the completion of the New Testament. And I'll just share a few examples from Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho. I shall attempt to prove my assertion, this is Justin talking, namely, that there exists and is mentioned in Scripture another God and Lord under the Creator of all things, who is also called an angel. We can go on. Then I said, if I could not prove to you from the Scriptures that one of the three entities appearing to Abraham is God, and yet is termed an angel because, as stated above, he delivered the messages of God, the creator of all, to whomsoever God desires. And then below, then I said, let us return to the scriptures, and I shall try to convince you that he who is said to have appeared to Abraham, Jacob, and Moses, and is called God, is distinct from God the Creator. Distinct, that is, in number, but not in mind. And know me there is a reference to rationality, intent, will. It does not mean in essence, as I've already pointed out elsewhere. And the examples of this could be repeated many times over in Justin. So even as late as around 150 CE, Jesus as Logos is not the Creator. So it seems to me that Patterson's argument presupposes that to be the Creator is to be God, which means that saying John 1:3 understands Jesus as the Logos to be God because Jesus is participating in the creation is to presuppose that to participate in the creation is to be the Creator. It just entirely flattens that distinction, and I am trying to highlight that distinction, which existed when the Gospel of John was written, and it existed even as late as Justin Martyr. It wasn't until after Justin Martyr that that distinction begins to be erased, and we're going to see that you're going to appeal to authors who are writing even later than that as some kind of evidence for what's going on in John chapter 1 and what's going on with the conceptualization of the Logos as having some role in creation. We can look before the Gospel of John in Philo, we can look after the Gospel of John in Justin Martyr, and the Logos is not the Creator. The Logos is the instrument that was leveraged by the Creator.
All things were created through him. If all things are created through Christ, then Christ, the Anointed One, and the Father are on one side of the creator-creature divide, and all other things are on the other side of the line. So it's certainly true that the eternal Father-Son union can be spoken of as having a certain taxis, a certain ordering. The Son does not eternally generate the Father. The Father does eternally generate the Son. The Son does not create all things through the Father. The Father creates all things through the Son. There is a taxis, there is an ordering. None of this brings into question Trinitarian theology at all. In fact, it only makes Athanasius's point. The Father-Son union is on the God side of the creator-creature distinction. Checkmate, Arians.
So this sounds more like Bauckham than it does Athanasius, but it's also begging the question.
So Dan Patterson did not say what Dan McClellan took him to be saying, and then Dan McClellan did not actually answer the issue that is thrown up by John 1 and the first 3 verses. So he misquoted his interlocutor and then he evaded the point at hand. But then notice how Dan himself invokes univocality straight away.
In short, to understand John 1:1c as identifying Jesus as God, one has to presuppose the Trinitarian Nicene notion of 3 persons simultaneously comprising a single essence or being. And that philosophical concept had never been articulated by the time of the composition of the Gospel of John. It would not be articulated for over a century later. And so it cannot be what the author of the Gospel of John intended, because it would not have been able to gain any purchase. Nobody would have understood what was going on there. Nobody would have gotten it. They would have interpreted it in entirely different ways, in ways that were already in circulation. And this is the biggest problem with trying to read Trinitarianism into John. It didn't exist yet. And so the author and all of the audience are all going to try to understand it according to interpretive conceptual frameworks that were already in circulation.
Do you notice here that Dan McClellan is invoking univocality here?
In absolutely no sense whatsoever am I invoking univocality.
He's basically expecting John in the 1st century to be using 4th century language, and if he's not using 4th century language, then he cannot be in any way, shape, or form Trinitarian. When Christians expect univocality from the Bible, we are fools. But Dan is expecting univocality across centuries. And if he doesn't see the exact same language being used, he's going to conclude that John 1 is not Trinitarian. Why is he expecting univocality? He's already poisoned that well. Why is he drinking from it?
This is a baffling, misguided straw man argument. At absolutely no point whatsoever have I ever said that the words and the language must be identical. This is Glen's misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what I mean by univocality, because it doesn't matter if the words are identical. It's the conceptual frameworks that are indexed by those words. And when you look at the development of the concept of the Trinity, you can see them working out the conceptual frameworks, even when the same words are being used. For instance, in the 2nd century CE, homoousios was rejected as a heresy because they had not yet argued for distinct persons within the one being. So the idea of homoousios was rejected as modalism because it meant only one person. So when homoousios is used at the beginning of the 4th century, it's indexing a conceptual framework that can now tolerate the multiple different persons. So the conceptual framework is different. So the notion that I'm, 1, invoking univocality, or 2, insisting that the same words must be used, otherwise it cannot be the same conceptual frameworks, is just bafflingly misguided. This has no relationship whatsoever to anything I have ever argued on social media or in peer-reviewed scholarship.
But then Dan goes on to talk about, okay, it's not a Trinitarian framework in John chapter 1. Instead, it's a logos Christology, as though these are like radically different things.
They are quite different. And here Glen betrays that he's still unwilling and or unable to decouple the lexeme, the word being used, from the conceptual content being indexed. Just because the same word is used does not mean the same concepts are being referred to. So this would be the presupposition of univocality according to Glen's misunderstanding of what I mean by univocality, because Glen seems to think that if logos theology is mentioned, then it is the same logos theology that is articulated in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE related to a Trinitarian understanding.
According to interpretive conceptual frameworks that were already in circulation. And the clearest one is the Logos framework, which Philo talks about at some length, and which most scholars agree is to one degree or another undergirding what the author of the Gospel of John is trying to say. And we can see before and after the Gospel of John that Logos theology is not identifying the Logos as God, but a distinct, separate entity and being. So they might be the same essence in the sense that one human shares the same human essence as another human, but not in the same sense as God the Father is the same being as God the Son, even if they occupy distinct persons. That framework didn't exist yet.
This is where I genuinely have a question for Dan. Does Dan McClellan know that Athanasius had a Logos Christology?
Yes, but I'm aware of the fact that the Logos theology held by Athanasius was not identical to the Logos theology held by Philo, or by the author of the Gospel of John, or by Justin Martyr, or by Athenagoras, because things change. And this is where Glen commits the error of the presupposition of univocality according to his misunderstanding of what I mean by univocality, because he seems to think it means that people have to say the exact same thing in order to be referring to the same concept. And therefore, I think that the only way John can assert Trinitarianism is if he uses the exact same terms. I've already discussed the fact that the same terms can refer to distinct conceptual frameworks. And that's what's going on with the idea of logos theology. But Glen here is overlooking that and suggesting that because Athanasius has a logos theology that fits within Trinitarianism, well, that must mean that Philo and the author of the Gospel of John and Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, when they talk about the logos, they must be talking about the exact same thing. Even though my point is precisely that we can see the development of that conceptual framework that is being indexed by these terms. And in the days of Philo and the author of the Gospel of John and Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, the conceptual frameworks that were being indexed by those terms were very different. And there is no evidence that the conceptual framework of the Trinity as three co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial persons comprising the one being, essence, or substance of God, that didn't exist. You don't have anyone articulate it. And again, you can track the trajectory of putting those pieces together to construct that conceptual framework. And it all takes place after the composition of the Gospel of John. In fact, the main pivot, at least regarding logos theology, occurs between Athenagoras and Irenaeus. Because prior to that, when you look at Philo and you look at the author of the Gospel of John and you look at Justin Martyr and you look at Athenagoras, they're primarily emphasizing the distinction of God the Father and God's logos. It's with Irenaeus that we pivot back to, one, more consciously emphasizing the scriptures over and against Greek philosophy, but two, emphasizing the unity of the Father and the Son rather than their distinction. And let's take a look at some of that, because in that clip that Glen played, I said you can look before and after the Gospel of John and see them distinguishing the Logos from God the Father and not endorsing the notion that they are consubstantial. So let's take a look at a couple passages from Philo. This is from his questions and answers on Genesis. This is section 62, where he's looking at Genesis 9, verse 6. Why does Scripture say, as if speaking of another God, in the image of God he made man, and not in his own image? Most excellently and veraciously, or truthfully, this oracle was given by God, for nothing mortal can be made in the likeness of the Most High One and Father of the universe, but only in that of the second God, who is his Logos. So the Logos is a distinct deity. The Logos is not the God of Israel. But let's take a look at another passage to further clarify how this works. This is from his text on Dreams, Book 1, section 228, 29, and 30. And he's inquiring whether there are two gods. For we read, I am the God that appeared to thee, not in my place, but in the place of God, as though it were another's. What then are we to say? He that is truly God is one. But those that are improperly so called are more than one. Accordingly, the Holy Word in the present instance has indicated him who is truly God by means of the articles, saying, I am the God, while it omits the article when mentioning him who is improperly so called, saying, who appeared to thee in the place not of the God, but simply of God. Here it gives the title of God to his chief word, or logos, not from any superstitious nicety in applying names, but with one aim before him, to use words to express facts. This is fascinating. Philo says there are other entities, other beings out there that are not the God of Israel that can be referred to as if they were God, but they are only improperly so named. And the Logos is one of those entities. And you distinguish the God of Israel from those who are improperly referred to as God, which includes the Logos, by the omission of the definite article. And this is fascinating because this is something that we see in several places in the Gospel of John, where Jesus or the Logos is referred to as God in some sense, but the definite article is omitted. And it's not just in Philo. It's not just in the Gospel of John. We also see it in Justin Martyr. We also see it in Origen. Origen even explicitly says that the omission of the article refers to the Logos. It's only the true God It's only the God of Israel when the article is there. And even as late as Eusebius of Caesarea, we have reference to this. So this is a fascinating idea that indicates that in this period they were not nearly as sensitive to the kind of strict philosophical monotheism that we get beginning at the end of the 2nd century CE. They're willing to say, yeah, there are other entities out there that can be referred to as God. They're not God, and we can distinguish them by using theos without the definite article. And that way, the title is being extended to them, but they're not actually the God of Israel. And Justin Martyr says the same. Let's take a look at his dialogue with Trypho. This is, I'm pretty sure, chapter 56. Then I said, let us return to the scriptures, and I shall try to convince you that he who is said to have appeared to Abraham, Jacob, and Moses, and is called God, by the way, Justin omits the definite article here, is distinct from God the Creator. Distinct, that is, in number, but not in mind. Now, mind here sometimes gets translated essence, and that is a straight-up mistranslation, and I'm going to share more about that in a moment, but gnomi is the word here, and the idea would really be will or intent or something like that. And the next sentence clarifies that. For I state that he never did or said anything other than what the Creator, above whom there is no other God, desired that he do or say. So their unity is in will, intent, agency, not in essence. So if you see someone who says that Justin Martyr says they are different in number but not in essence, that's a mistranslation. And let's go a little further on. I believe this is chapter 61, I could be wrong. The Holy Spirit indicates this power by various titles, sometimes the glory of the Lord, at other times Son, or Wisdom, or Angel, or God, or Lord, or Word. That would be Logos. He even called himself Commander-in-Chief when he appeared in human guise to Joshua, the son of Nun. Indeed, he can justly lay claim to all these titles from the fact both that he performs the Father's will, that's that unity in gnomi, in mind, will, intent, and that he was begotten by an act of the Father's will. So begotten of God. So he can adopt these titles. Now let's take a look at what precisely scholars think is going on here. The Cambridge History of Philosophy in Late Antiquity has a wonderful essay by Dennis Minns on Justin Martyr. And in the red box here we see the Logos is described as an other God. Distinct in number, but not in intention. This has been taken to imply that the two are the same in substance. But Justin means, as Trypho understands him to mean, that the other God has never done or said anything other than what the Maker of all intends. Alcinous also speaks of the obedience of the created gods to the Creator. Justin disagrees with those, perhaps among his co-religionists, who believe that this power is indivisible and inseparable from the Father in the way the light of the sun is inseparable from the sun itself. This would be that consubstantiality. Justin does not agree with that consubstantiality. When Justin says that the Logos was begotten from the Father by the Father's power and will, and not by abscission, this is to eliminate any suggestion that the divine substance is divided or altered. It is not to make a claim of substantial unity of the Logos with God. Because in this time period, the point was not to say they are consubstantial, they are the same essence. The concern with the notion of dividing or altering the ousia was a concern with the notion that you lop off part of the ousia and then the main ousia is therefore diminished. That's the main reason that Justin is bringing up whether or not this abscission occurs, to alter the ousia or divide the ousia. It's not divide the ousia in the Nicene sense of consubstantiality. It's a different idea. So both Philo and Justin, and we could even go to Origen, and we could have them describe the Logos as a distinct, a separate, a second God. So on what grounds do we argue that the Gospel of John, coming in between Philo and Justin, is actually presenting the fully developed Nicene notion of the Trinity that didn't exist when that text was written, that we don't see being constructed until after the composition of the Gospel of John. You have no way to demonstrate that that understanding was available to the author of the Gospel of John or anyone else. And you can hardly argue that the author of the Gospel of John is presenting that understanding originally, that this is the first and the main articulation of that doctrine, because the Gospel of John is way pared down. It is not articulating all of those ideas. Philo and Justin go into a lot more detail about what the Logos is than does the Gospel of John. So we have fewer data to work with in the Gospel of John's presentation of what the Logos is than we do with Philo and Justin. And we can see that Philo and Justin don't have a Logos theology or doctrine that matches Athanasius's or matches the Nicene notion. Theirs is a very different doctrine. And so we can hardly conclude that the less detailed, more generic representation of the Logos that comes in between the two of them, namely that of the Gospel of John, actually anticipates the fully articulated and worked out and constructed doctrine of the Trinity. This is what I'm talking about. And you cannot even pretend to demonstrate that I am wrong. Because there is nothing in the literature of Judaism or Christianity prior to the mid to late 2nd century CE that even hints at the Nicene notion of the Trinity as three consubstantial, co-equal, co-eternal persons comprising the one essence, substance, or ousia of God. It didn't exist. And there is no methodological fallacy or problem in my observation that it didn't exist. And this is the only thing that apologists can do, though, because they can't show that it existed. They can't point to any texts that actually articulate that idea, because it didn't exist. And so what they have to do is pretend that there's some kind of methodological issue that I am getting tangled up in, and that I have misunderstood, and then I'm not aware that Athanasius had a Logos theology. You can't even pretend to engage the data.
Does he know that pretty much everybody had a Logos Christology, including Arius, right? And so to that degree, like, it's very interesting to figure out, okay, so this Logos through whom God does a whole bunch of stuff, is that Logos on the creator side of things or on the creature side of things?
If you want to leverage Balcom's divine identity Christology as a rhetorical shoehorn, I'm going to have to ask that you actually engage my published peer-reviewed criticism of that Christological model.
But to say that John 1 doesn't have any kind of Trinitarian formulation because instead it has a Logos Christology reminds me of, the story of, geologists in Yellowstone National Park who were seeing signs of volcanic ash everywhere. There are signs everywhere that there have been volcanic explosions. But you can imagine the geologist that says, well, I look all around Yellowstone National Park and I can't see any volcanoes, so I guess I'm just going to have to explain away all the ash and all the other signs that there have been volcanic eruptions over eons. Of course, you know the punchline to that story. Do you know that Yellowstone National Park doesn't have volcanoes within it? Yellowstone National Park is a volcano. It is this kind of mega volcano. And to look all throughout Yellowstone National Park and to try to identify a volcano that is a discrete entity like within the park would be a massive mistake, wouldn't it? They are within the volcano. And just because you can't point to a volcano from within Yellowstone National Park does not mean you should start denying all the evidence for volcanic activity. There is evidence of volcanic activity because the whole thing is a volcano. And like watching Dan McClellan talk about John's Gospel is a little bit like that. It's a little bit like looking at a geologist who's just insisting, no matter how much volcanic ash there is everywhere, how many signs there are that he's living within a volcano. No, it can't be a volcano because I don't see that outline of a volcano, and it's not using 4th century language in John's Gospel. Of course, it's not using 4th century language in the first century. But Dan McClellan here is pointing to pretty much every feature of Trinitarian theology and then saying, oh, but it can't be Trinitarian theology because nobody said the word hypostasis, the philosophical term for person that was used in the 4th century. Because no one says homoousion in John chapter 1, therefore it's not using Trinitarian conceptuality. And the whole irony is that he is expecting univocality, and it's precisely because he doesn't see univocality that he then thinks, well, we must be talking about completely different doctrines of God.
So this, once again, demonstrates a just baffling misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what I have always meant when I have talked about univocality, and it, again, betrays the dogmatic lenses through which Glen is looking at all of these data. Because the notion that Athanasius had a logos theology, therefore John's logos theology must be Trinitarian, is just pure and utter nonsense. It's based on the presupposition that a logos theology is a single thing that never changed. And this analogy about geologists looking at evidence for volcanic activity and not finding a volcano and going, it doesn't matter that all this evidence is here, there's just no volcano, is another ridiculous misunderstanding and misrepresentation. I have repeatedly made clear on my channel, maybe not in the specific video that he was sharing, but repeatedly I have made clear that I'm trying to connect the dots of these data in the most critical way I can, trying to understand how they operated on their own terms. And if I arrive at a conclusion that supports some apologetic ideology, so be it. I don't care. If I arrive at some conclusion that undermines or rejects some apologetic ideology, or the ideology or doctrine of my own religious tradition, so be it. I don't care. It's the same for me. I don't care what conclusion I arrive at. Glen cares what conclusion he arrives at, which is why he cannot understand how someone cannot find the Trinity in a text that does not have the Trinity in it, but is using terms that he knows are associated with the Trinity, or at least were hundreds of years later. And so let me provide a couple of analogies of my own. Let's take a look at these 3 images. I would compare what we have in the Gospel of John to the dots on the left. This is labels it knowledge. I would say these are the data. I would suggest that a lot of critical scholarly attempts to understand what's going on in the Gospel of John based on the ideological, the philosophical, the theoretical frameworks that were in circulation in the 1st century CE represents what's going on in the middle. This labels it experience, but I think what I would label this is an attempt to try to understand these data on their own terms. What we have on the right would be the Trinity, because it is an intentional attempt to construct a specific picture of the data. Now, if you've spent your entire life understanding those dots to be connected in that way, that's how you're always going to see them. You cannot unsee the cat if you have only ever seen the cat. And so this is what Glen is doing, looking at the dots without the lines connecting them and going, Dan's an idiot because he can't see the cat. When the reality is, the vision of the cat is an outcome of those dogmatic lenses that we already know Glen is happy to acknowledge he is imposing on these data. Twice in this video, he's already said, I look at this through the lens of Jesus. And then here's another illustration of this. We have at the top, the data. How scientists see it, I would suggest, is an attempt on the part of someone trying to approach these things critically to reconstruct how these data were operating on their own terms. On the bottom, we have the dogmatic approach to this. And if you've only ever experienced the dogmatic approach, then it's not going to make sense to you to remove the lines that are connecting the dots and arrive at anything other than the dogmatic conclusion. So Glen accuses me of having dogmatic lenses that do not allow me to see what's in front of me, while Glen explicitly acknowledges that he wears dogmatic lenses. And while Glen wildly misunderstands and misrepresents me in an attempt to try to perform a plausible, believable argument for why his position is right that doesn't even contain any actual arguments. It just contains preaching to the choir and an analogy here and there and an accusation that I am doing what Glen is actually doing.
Let's jump on a little bit in the video.
The interpretive lens that is required to understand John 1:1c as identifying the Logos as a distinct person of the one God of Israel simply didn't exist when the text was written. And you can't just argue, well, we're going to presuppose it anyway. You can't just say, well, it's what they came up later with because they just didn't have the words for it. You cannot communicate a conceptual framework that you can't talk about. That's not how that works.
But Dan, okay, so let's bring John 1 up. Okay, so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Go down to verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, the monogenes, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth, which is the very name of God. John 1 verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. From the beginning, God has always worked through his God from God. He has always worked through his Word, who has constantly been communicating the Father from the beginning. He is God in the bosom of God and has been from the beginning. You don't need to use the language of homoousion topatry. You don't need to use the language of hypostasis and ousia. You don't need to use that language. You can use John's language just fine. If you're dealing with a Middle Platonist called Arius, who's got his dodgy doctrine of God, then you might need to use those philosophical terms. But that does not define what the doctrine of the Trinity is. The doctrine of the Trinity is defined by Jesus is Lord, even as he is Son of the Father filled with the Spirit. He is of God and he is God. He's distinct from the Father, but he's fully God. And Trinitarian theology, as it developed, said, okay, when we talk in distinction terms, we're using person, hypostasis, and when we're talking in terms of the being of God, we're using ousia terms. These are helpful conceptual tools and clarifications along the way, but that doesn't make Trinitarian theology. Jesus is God from God, light from light, very God from very God. That's what makes Trinitarian theology, and John's gospel is Trinitarian theology. He is the one sent from the Father who has always enjoyed the eternal life of God from the beginning. Through him all things were made. Therefore he is creator, right? Co-creator with the Father and the Spirit. But he is the one sent from the Father as the great I am. He is God and he's from God. He's distinct from the Father. I guess he's a distinct person. And yet he is the great I am. I guess he is God. This is so much simpler, so much more clarifying, and so much more attractive than anything Dan McClellan brings to bear as an explanatory hypothesis for how to fit together this data. The dogma of the Trinity unlocks Scripture, gives to you a God who is love, proclaims to you a salvation that is unimprovable in its dimensions, and it has been the most fruitful interpretive lens through which people have done biblical studies in the history of biblical studies. By comparison, I don't find Dan McClellan's interpretive lenses to be compelling or helpful or inspiring or life-giving or any of those things.
So again, we have Glen using preaching and sermonizing as a proxy for an argument, because I'm sure it set off the tuning fork in the loins of the dogmatism of plenty of people in Glen's audience to hear all those Trinitarian slogans. But notice what Glen never offered once in that entire clip: an argument for why that interpretation ought to be preferred. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm trying to provide. An argument supported by evidence for why the interpretation that I have shared is most likely. Glen just read parts of John 1 and then said, this is the Trinity. And did so by just rattling off a bunch of Trinitarian slogans. Never once said we should interpret this verse this way because of these reasons and these data. And then ended by, again, appealing to this notion that it should be life-giving and fruitful. In terms of what? Well, of course, Glen is looking at this through the dogmatic lenses of Jesus, and so he wants it to set off the tuning fork in the loins of his own dogmatism regarding Jesus. He wants that collective effervescence of Jesusness. That's how Glen is assessing these arguments, because he can't assess them critically. He's already acknowledged he's not a specialist on this. So Glen is not providing an argument. Glen is not engaging my argument. Glen is just saying, here's John 1, it's the Trinity, here are a bunch of Trinitarian slogans, and that's just going to make his audience feel good, but it doesn't address, much less undermine, the argument that I provided.
But let's keep going.
So the question is, how would the audience, how would the author have understood the notion of the logos as theos in a qualitative sense? And again, logos theology is the best candidate for the interpretive lens to understand this. And when we impose logos theology, it's kind of an emanationist theology. It's kind of a subordinate secondary agent theology, which would agree with verse 3.
Yes, certain theologians of logos Christology go down this subordinationist route, Arius being one of them. But what does he mean by emanationist? Athanasius is very happy to say Christ is eternally begotten of the Father. But all of this conversation is happening within logos Christology. Logos Christology is not an alternative to Trinitarian theology. I'm not sure Dan McClellan understands that. I don't think I'm smarter than Dan McClellan. I don't think I'm better read than Dan McClellan. I don't think I have greater expertise in any of these things than Dan McClellan. But I do suspect he is coming at Scripture with a preordained doctrine of God, which will not allow him to take Jesus seriously.
So this would be wrong. I do my best to try to allow the data to operate on their own terms. And in order to do that, I have to not care what conclusion I arrive at. And I have repeatedly on my channel pointed out that there is no single doctrine of God in the Bible. When we look at the texts and allow them to operate on their own terms, in their initial settings, we see a variety of different doctrines of God. And none of them are my personal doctrine of God. My personal doctrine of God doesn't play a role in my critical interrogation of what's going on in the Bible. And it can't, for me to be able to pretend that I'm allowing the data to operate on their own terms. Glen cannot say the same. And that means that Glen's lenses are always going to be biased towards his own doctrine of God. And I'm well aware that Athanasius's logos theology is a Trinitarian one, but that has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on what Philo's logos theology was, or the Gospel of John's logos theology, or Justin Martyr's logos theology. We have to allow them to operate on their own terms. And as I've repeatedly pointed out, we can observe the construction of the conceptual framework of the Trinity. We can see it being worked out with people saying, no, what about this? No, what about this? No, emphasize this. No, that's wrong. And constructing what we have finalized in the 4th and 5th centuries. And it's just not there in the 1st century.
I forget the theologian who summarized Athanasius's theology. His whole theological method was the only system of thought into which Jesus Christ will fit is the one in which he's the starting point. If you start with the absolute deity and then ask the question, well, what are we now going to do with Jesus? You just can't do it. Either he's going to dissolve into this absolute being of God, and then you've become a modalist, really. He's just one more form of the one God. You've lost all distinction. Or Jesus kind of sinks down into the realm of creatureliness, at which point you're a subordinationist, you're an Arian.
So 2 things here. I don't have to make it work. I don't care if it works or not, because I'm not doing theology. I'm just trying to understand what these authors meant with their texts and how their audiences understood them. And it may or may not have worked, which brings up the second thing. By worked, Glen here means fits an orthodox Trinitarian framework. Because who cares if it descends to modalism or if it's tritheism? Only someone who's presupposing a Trinitarian orthodoxy. Without that orthodoxy framework, they can all work to the degree they satisfy the social groups that endorse them. So Glen is presupposing Orthodox Trinitarianism in the argument for why my approach doesn't work, which is something I don't care about to begin with.
The only system of thought into which Jesus Christ will fit is the one in which you take seriously what Jesus says about himself. He says in John 17, verse 24, "Father, you loved me before the creation of the world." John says that the Son who is God, he is God towards God, John chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. He is the God through whom God created all things. He is God in the bosom of God, John chapter 1, verse 18. That the Son-Father dynamic is internal to the life of God, not external.
So once again, Glen is just asserting Trinitarian interpretations of passages within John and using preaching and sermonizing as a proxy for an actual argument. And Glen has not addressed my argument, because I pointed out in the clip he shared what is the interpretive lens that makes sense of what the author was trying to say. Not what is the interpretive lens that renders this Trinitarian orthodoxy. That's begging the question. I'm trying to understand what they were trying to say on their own terms, not on Trinitarian terms. And if that means that they weren't Trinitarian, so be it. I don't care. Glen very clearly cares. Glen cannot allow John to not be a Trinitarian. So Glen must presuppose that it is Trinitarian, and that is why Glen is not providing an argument. Glen is just asserting things.
But to become Trinitarian, you cannot have a prefabricated doctrine of God and then try and fit the Son of the Father in there. It will either be out to one side and you're a tritheist, or he'll be underneath and you'll be a subordinationist, or he'll be dissolved within and you'll be a modalist. To be a Trinitarian, you need to start with the Father-Son union in the Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be forever.
So Glen just said, to be Trinitarian, you cannot have a prefabricated doctrine of God and then try to force the Son of the Father in there because you become a tritheist or you become an Arian or you become a modalist. And why is that a problem? Because these 3 things don't fit Glen's prefabricated doctrine of God, namely Trinitarianism, which must be presupposed for any of this to work. So Glen is begging the question just ferociously throughout this entire video.
It doesn't make Jesus God, though. And I don't think a lot of people are ready for that discussion.
Then at the end of the gospel in John 20:28, the apostle Thomas abandons his doubts in the presence of the resurrected Jesus, confessing him as my Lord and my God, an open statement of divine worship that Jesus never corrects.
So I addressed John 20:28 in my video number McClellan 3098, and I have also addressed this many times in the past. And again, we're dealing with this seeming conflation of Jesus and God. How do we understand what's going on here? We've got an algebra problem and we've got to solve for X. What is the explanation, the conceptual framework that allows us to solve for X? If you're a Trinitarian, it's the later developed notion of 3 persons simultaneously occupying one essence, one substance, one being, one God. But again, that framework didn't exist when the Gospel of John was written. So we have to go and seek out a framework that was in circulation in that time period. And as I have explained, the most ubiquitous concept of divine mediation, divine presencing in the entire ancient world was the intuitive logic of divine images. It is so ubiquitous that it is even something that happens still today. And according to that logic, a divine being can be presenced. In other words, their presence can be manifested, it can be reified, it can be borne by either material media that is animate or material media that is inanimate. And in my 2022 book, Adonai's Divine Images, I discuss all of the cognitive features of the human mind that contribute to this. And I show that this explains how divine images were understood to work in the ancient world.
Now, I'm about a third of my way through Yahweh, or as he would say, Adonai's Divine Images. Yep, and I kind of haven't got to the meat of things yet, because he begins with cognitive science and ways in which societies might have come up with concepts of divinity, and a lot of it has to do with ancestors and transcending death through attachment to ancestors, and ideas of deity kind of emerge in an evolutionary sense, and cognitive science has given us the tools to kind of figure some of that out. And the ways in which societies have wanted to presence the deity has largely been through, well, firstly, inanimate objects, and then Dan McClellan moves to looking at the temple and ways in which inanimate objects are said to presence the Lord. And only then does Dan McClellan look at the messenger of the Lord, the Malach Adonai, otherwise known as the angel of the Lord. And only then does he see personal presencing of the name and presence of God in the person of the messenger of the Lord. But do you get that order? For Dan McClellan, there is a kind of a concept, a vague concept of deity that has evolutionary utility. You study that via the cognitive sciences. You look for evidence in the scriptures of ways in which primitive societies have tried to presence the deity via inanimate objects, and then you start to look at primitive ways in which the Bible speaks of that presence being in a shadowy figure like the messenger of the Lord. Of course, that is not the way that the Old Testament presents things. The way the Old Testament presents things is, well, John 1:18, no one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who's at the Father's side, he has made him known. That there has been the personal presencing of God in the one and only Son, and that the pre-incarnate Christ has made these Christophanies all throughout the Old Testament.
So that's a serviceable summary of part of my book. However, to then just assert that's not how the Old Testament presents things is the rhetorical equivalent of nuh-uh, which is obviously good enough for his audience and demonstrates again that the intent is not to actually engage my argument on my terms. The point here is to just perform criticism for an audience that already agrees. But then Glen goes on to actually make a claim that my argument actually doesn't entirely conflict with. Because part of my point, and you need to get really to the appendix to get the whole point, is precisely that early Christians understood Jesus through the interpretive lens of the Malach Adonai, who was represented as an animate divine image. So Glen is kind of walking into the rhetorical snare of my book, so to speak. I'm not laying a rhetorical snare, but I'm arriving at a conclusion that actually mostly agrees with what Glen is saying here in his attempt to try to correct me. Now, the main difference is that Glen wants that later Christian renegotiation to have been what was intended all along by all the authors of the Hebrew Bible. And obviously, that is anachronistic. That is presupposing univocality. Glen cannot even begin to make a case for why that should be understood as the most likely interpretation of what's going on in the Hebrew Bible. But again, he doesn't need to do that for his audience because the rhetorical equivalent of nuh-uh is good enough. So Glen just needs to make the audience feel better about disagreeing with me, even though in this instance, he kind of agrees with me. He just doesn't know it yet, and also isn't prepared to directly confront the disagreement.
One of the names by which Christ has been known in the Old Testament has been the angel of the Lord, the Malach Adonai. And here on screen, you can see all the places in which the angel of the Lord appears in the Old Testament. Let's just rattle through a few of them. Genesis chapter 16, Hagar is there in the wilderness. Then the angel of the Lord told Hagar, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You're now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." So the angel of the Lord is of the Lord. He is the sent one of the Lord. That's most literally what malach means. It means angel, messenger, but the one who is sent from the Lord, who speaks about the Lord in the third person. But he's also able to make covenant promises like, "I will increase your descendants." And she understands who he is. Verse 13, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That's why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. Bir Lahai Roi means the well of the living one who sees me. And so he's of the Lord, and he is the Lord, and he's the God of seeing. This actually is how Genesis reveals things. And of course, John says, well, this is just the pre-incarnate Christ. We know that no one has ever seen God. But the one and only Son who's at the Father's side, he has been making him known. He's always been making him known. He is the eternal Word of the Father from the very beginning.
So it seems, based on the discussion up to this point, that Glen has not yet arrived to the meat of chapter 5, which is where I discuss this and several other passages where the identity of the messenger of Adonai and the God of Israel seem to be both distinguished and conflated. I talk about what's going on there in chapter 5. I won't waste my time holding my breath for Glen to come back and give us an update about the significance of my discussion to what he just shared here.
We'll just do two more angel of the Lord passages. I mean, Genesis chapter 48, he's in Genesis quite a bit, but right at the end, Jacob is blessing Joseph and his boys, and he says, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys." Who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Who is the source of blessing? Who is the good shepherd who redeems from all harm? The angel of the Lord, right? The sent one of God, who the patriarchs identified as their God. Who is the God of Abraham? The sent one of the Lord, who also is the Lord.
This is actually not an angel of the Lord passage. It just uses malach. It does not use the construct phrase malach Adonai, malach Elohim, malach ha-Elohim. This is a separate phenomenon entirely. But if you're presupposing univocality and it helps you to understand this as a messenger of Adonai passage, obviously there's nothing the data can do to change your mind.
Go to Exodus chapter 3. Here is the burning bush. Here is the definitional event that marks out the God of the Old Testament as the God of the Old Testament. Here is the Lord who brings his people up from Egypt. How is he described? Verse 2. There the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." So who's in the bush? The one sent from the Lord, who is also called Lord and God and the great I Am. Moses was afraid to look at God in Exodus chapter 3, but of course no one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, the monogenes Son. The one and only Son who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. He has always been making him known. All revelation is always from the Father through the Son by the Spirit. That's the way. To be Trinitarian is to know this God from God, this light from light, this true God from true God, of one being with the Father, who for us and for our salvation came down into a burning bush and came down even further into our flesh, came down even further all the way to the cross. And it's not univocality because Moses speaks about him in different ways to the way that John describes him, but they're describing the same person. The same salvation, the same God.
In other words, it's the presupposition of univocality. But One passage that Glen doesn't talk about here is Exodus 23, which is where God tells the Israelites, I'm sending an angel before you to guide you along the way. Don't disobey him, don't tick him off, because he won't forgive your transgressions, because my name is in him. And as I argue in the book and have argued elsewhere, this passage is trying to make sense of the fact that the messenger of Adonai seems to be able to do what only God is supposed to be able to do, and even say, as the messenger does in Exodus 3:6, I am the God of your father. And how does Exodus 23 account for that? It says, because my name is in him. In other words, the divine name is some kind of communicable vehicle of divine presence and authority and agency. And so the authorized possessor of that divine name gets to speak on behalf of God, gets to manifest God's presence, gets to have authority over the forgiveness of sins, even as the messenger does, again in Exodus 3:6, speak as God and explicitly identify as God. Now, in the book, I point out this is actually a relic of textual interpolation, but Exodus 23 is still giving an explanation for how it can be that the messenger does all these things. My name is in him is not, he is consubstantial with me. My name is in him is an endowment. It is an extension of that communicable vehicle of divine agency. And in the book, I go through other figures that similarly are endowed with, are given that power, that authority, that ability to presence. And that's also what we see in the Gospel of John, where Jesus talks about the divine name being given to him, talks about God's glory being given to him. And then in John 14 and then again in John 20, we have the idea of Jesus manifesting the Father. Philip doesn't realize that to see Jesus is to see the Father. Why? Jesus isn't the Father. Jesus presences the Father because he's acting like a walking, talking, speaking, breathing divine image, which was intended to manifest the presence of the deity. And so in John 20:28, Thomas finally gets it and says, I'm looking at Jesus, my Lord, but also my God. So Glen doesn't seem aware that the theoretical framework I'm developing explains all of this. And he's certainly not going to try to explain why Exodus 23 actually asserts Trinitarianism. He's got to ignore that because that's an explanation that would undermine the notion that this is all Trinitarianism and was always understood as Trinitarianism. It wasn't. It was understood as something entirely different. It was understood because of the intuitive logic of divine images, which is the argument of my book.
That's what explains the scriptures, and that's what explains the doctrine of the Trinity. But Dan's not really getting it.
Again and again, Glen demonstrates that there is only one overarching principle. You must agree with Orthodox Trinitarianism. The data and the best explanation doesn't matter. All that matters is that we agree with Orthodox Trinitarianism. This is the very definition of dogmatism. This is putting dogma directly over data.
Now, I need to say very firmly that even though the early church was pretty united on seeing the angel of the Lord as the pre-incarnate Christ, I think John is definitely saying that the angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Christ. I think that the Reformers and the Puritans were very clear and united on saying that the angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Christ. That doesn't mean he's a creature at all. Like angel does not mean creature. Angel means messenger or sent one. And it does not mean at all that Christ came into being at some point in time. To say that would make you an Arian. It would be to say that there's a time when the Son was not. I'm certainly not saying that. But I am saying that from all eternity, there has been a God from God union. And what John is saying is that no one has ever experienced God truly except in the Son. Therefore, when Jesus, in John chapter 14, for instance, says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, he's not saying, you can see the Father through all sorts of things. You can see the Father if you look at this inanimate object or that inanimate object, at me, Tom, Bill, Dick, Harry. Jesus is saying he is the unique and eternal conduit of the name and nature of God. That's what he's saying in John chapter 14. And remember, we're heading towards Thomas in John chapter 20 and how it is that Thomas can say, my Lord and my God.
And Jesus says, Philip, come on, dude. Have you been around me so long and you've not realized that to see me is to see the Father? And then it's not because Jesus is the Father. That would violate Trinitarianism. Jesus goes on to explain that there is a mutual indwelling. The Father is dwelling in Jesus and Jesus is dwelling in the Father. And he repeats himself multiple times and goes on to say that that mutual indwelling will one day include his followers. And that's what he prays in John 17 in the intercessory prayer, that his followers may become one with him exactly as he is one with the Father, that they may be perfect in one. And so what Philip misunderstands, Thomas finally gets. Because Jesus wants Philip to know that, hey, when you see me, you also see the Father. Again, not because Jesus is the Father, but because the Father is dwelling in Jesus. Jesus is bearing, manifesting the presence of the Father. So Philip should look at Jesus and say, I see Jesus. I also see the Father. And that is what Thomas recognizes in John 20:28. My Lord and my God. I'm looking at Jesus and I'm also seeing the Father. So I am addressing Jesus, and in addressing Jesus, I am also addressing the Father. That makes the best sense of all of the Gospel of John, far more than the notion that this conceptual and philosophical framework that didn't exist yet is accounting for what's going on there, because it doesn't really account for it, because Jesus repeatedly distinguishes himself from the very God of Israel. Jesus doesn't say, well, that part of the God that I'm not. Jesus says, you are the only true God, addressing the Father, distinguishing the Father from himself as the only true God. But Jesus bears the Father so that Thomas can say, oh, I see them both, my Lord and my God.
I mean, there's various ways of reading Thomas. That's not the silliest way to read Thomas's line there. I think the Jehovah's Witnesses basically say that Thomas is swearing at this point. It's like, my Lord, my God, when he sees the wounds of Christ. So much do those particular Arians, the Jehovah's Witnesses, not want to see the Trinity. But I mean, even if he's right, he's saying, the Son is the Lord and the Father is God. Well, that's a pretty New Testament designation. That's true all throughout the New Testament. God, theos, seems to be the word for the Father, and kurios, Lord, seems to be the word for the Son. But if you thought that kurios was a less divine word than theos, then you haven't read the Septuagint, you haven't read the Greek Old Testament, because 6,800 times Adonai, Yahweh, right, is the divine name. It's Lord. Like, Lord is far more the title for the God of Israel than Elohim is, than God is, than Theos is, right?
Yes, and in the Hebrew Bible, the authors played in the ambiguity with the messenger of Adonai, who could be both identified with but also distinguished from God. And in my book, I talk about why that is. And that same ambiguity is there to play in with the Greek term kyrios, which could be understood as the substitution for the divine name, as it is in the Septuagint, or it can be understood as a deferential, respectful way to refer to somebody, which it also can be. And so there's ambiguity to play in still, because Jesus is manifesting the presence of God. And so it's not the authors of the New Testament saying, well, Jesus is Adonai. Duh. Because they're still distinguishing theos from kyrios consistently, where theos is God and kyrios is Jesus. There's ambiguity to play in. And so the question then becomes, what is the explanation that accounts for that? And a Trinitarian is going to say Trinitarianism, but they're not going to be able to make a very good argument for that. My argument is the one that is actually based on the data. and is actually based on what's in the text, without the importation, the retrojection, the presupposition of a bunch of dogmas that are not in evidence. That's the main difference here.
So all these gymnastics in order to just, Thomas is seeing God from God, light from light, very God from very God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven, right? That is what John is doing. He's seeing the sent one from the Father, the monogenes Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, who is the only one who can bear the name and nature of God. This idea of he is the authorized bearer of the name is to assume that there are a whole bunch of other authorized bearers of the name.
No, it's not. And this is where Glen must assert this, because otherwise my position actually kind of agrees with him. But in order to make it sound like my position is not precisely what John 1:18 says, that the monogenes makes him known, exegetes him by bearing his presence and manifesting it, I'm not suggesting that in the New Testament the authors imagine there to be all different kinds of bearers of the divine name. Jesus is the authorized bearer. All of these different figures are being consolidated in the figure of Jesus, whether it's the Son of Man, or it's the messenger of Adonai, or anyone else. They're all being consolidated in Jesus. He's the only one who does this in the eyes of the authors of the New Testament. However, you do have a divination soteriology in the Gospel of John, where that indwelling is going to be extended to Jesus' followers. So there is an eschatological extension of that to Jesus' followers that is hinted at in John. But no, the New Testament authors are not treating inanimate objects and kings and prophets and all these people as authorized bearers of the divine name. I've never said that. That is something that Glen is making up to try to distinguish what's going on in John from what I'm arguing is going on in John.
Now, there is one unique authorized bearer of the name, and eternally so. His name is Jesus Christ. In him we now carry his name out to the nations. But apart from him, there is no other mediator of the divine presence and name. And to be that person is to be the sent one from the Father, the great I am, which is who Jesus is. And this is just, we don't need to go centuries later than John to understand these things. We need to go centuries earlier than John, and I think they'll all make sense.
Well, you have to bring the things from centuries later and retroject them into the text from centuries earlier. That's kind of how Trinitarianism works.
Now let's wrap this up because I've gone on far too long, but let's do tricks 9 and 10. Trick number 9, if you're going to run the Dan McClellan playbook, you need to ignore inconvenient points, because Dan Patterson actually raises a whole raft of verses, and Dan McClellan actually ignores the one that is inconvenient to his thesis.
That's what's going on in John 20:28.
And why did Jesus' opponents try to kill him in John 5:18, 8:59, and 10:33?
Because they considered what he was saying to be blasphemous.
Because they understood Jesus to be committing blasphemy, making himself equal with God.
But that is not claiming to be God. Blasphemy includes all kinds of speech that is considered to denigrate, to mock, to deride, to debase God. So there are all kinds of things that Jesus could have said to be accused of blasphemy, not only making himself God.
And so he's going to ignore John 5 verse 18. John 5 verse 18, they pick up stones to stone him because he's just called himself the unique and eternal Son of the Father, and they say, you make yourself out to be Son of the Father, therefore making yourself equal to God. So what is their doctrine of God? Their doctrine of God is that you can be distinct in person and yet have the same ousia, have the same nature as God. That is what the opponents of Jesus, that is their doctrine of God there in the first century. To be the Son of the Father is to be equal to God, is a first century doctrine of God, and it's not even just the Christians who have it. It's right there in John 5 verse 18. To be the Son of the Father is to be equal to God. That is the most Trinitarian statement you can possibly have, and even the enemies of Jesus have a doctrine of God that is more capable of understanding Nicaea than certainly Dan McClellan's vision of God.
In absolutely no sense whatsoever is the author of the Gospel of John presenting the Pharisees in John 5:18 as Trinitarians who believe that you can be a separate person of the one ousia of God. There are absolutely no data that you could adduce to construct anything remotely approximating a plausible case for that reading of John 5:18. The idea is to be the Son of God is to be divine, and so to be equal with God in the sense of being divine like God. Just like I am equal to my Father in our shared humanity, to be the Son of God is to be a deity like God, to be divine like God. That's what they're complaining about in absolutely no sense whatsoever. Are they actually saying, you're making yourself the second co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial person of the one ousia substance or being of the God of Israel? Again, that framework didn't exist in the first century CE. You cannot demonstrate it existed. You cannot make anything, again, remotely approximating a plausible case that it existed. You can only assert it existed and count on enough of your audience already agreeing with you about that.
And the final trick of Dan McClellan is to assume your conclusion. Just assume the conclusion from the outset. And let's just go to the 20-minute mark where we are discussing John 17 and the great high priestly prayer.
And in his high priestly prayer in John 17, Jesus calls the Father to glorify him with the glory they shared before the world began, prior to creation.
But this overlooks something that's going on in chapter 17. Jesus did not always have that glory, because verse 22 talks about how the Father gave him that glory. Similarly, earlier in the chapter, the Father gave him the name, the divine name. These are things that Jesus, as the Logos, did not eternally possess. There is a point at which both the name and God's glory were given to Jesus.
Just read it again. John 17, verse 24. Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am and to see my glory, the glory you've given to me because you loved me before the creation of the world. This is the pre-creation, pre-temporal life of God, in which the Father is sharing his love with his Son, his glory with his Son, his name with his Son, his words with his Son, his joy with his Son. Trace out in John 17 all the Niagara Falls of blessing that's just crashing down from the Father to the Son. And it is the glory, it is the name, it is the words, it is the joy, it is the love of the Father, which is given to Christ before the world began. So yes, in the pre-creation, eternal, and everlasting life of God, there is a life of eternal begetting. There is a taxis. There is an ordering from Father to Son by the Spirit, and from Son to Father by the Spirit. But the love and life and glory and words and name of God is given to Christ as an eternal reality. And that might not jive with your doctrine of God, but whatever it is, it's not a maths problem.
So I've been accused here of begging the question, it seems to me, but I have yet to see an argument for how I've begged the question, much less that I've begged the question. Again, Glen seems to be preaching as a proxy for an argument, specifically preaching about how this is an eternal giving. But you've got to make a case for why we should interpret the perfect verb in John 17 as indicating an eternal giving, rather than a giving that took place at a specific point in time. That would be begging the question. To argue that I'm begging the question because I don't recognize that this is an eternal giving, because no argument has been provided for why that is the best understanding of what's being stated in John 17.
It is the good news that God is love, and you are invited. I want those who you've given me to be with me where I am, says Jesus, and to see my glory, the glory you've given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. We are created out of love to share in this love, to stand with Christ in that eternal flow by the Spirit, to know his Father as our Father, to know his Spirit as our Spirit, to know his future as our future. This is good news. It's not a maths problem.
John 12 says Isaiah saw Jesus' glory in his Old Testament vision of Yahweh.
Yes, and this is very clearly based on the early Christian idea that is even expressed in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, that in the Hebrew Bible, the theophanies, the visions of God, are not actually visions of God themselves, but visions of the pre-incarnate Jesus, or the Logos, who is also identified with the messenger of Adonai, whose identity is conflated with God in several places in the Hebrew Bible.
Why do you say conflated with God? Why would you say conflated with God?
Well, you will know when you get to chapter 5 in my book.
He simply is the God of Isaiah. I saw the Lord high and lifted up. I don't think anyone would blame Isaiah for putting the person he saw in the temple within his doctrine of God. Why does anyone have a problem with putting Jesus right at the heart of their doctrine of God? We have all the ingredients for Trinitarian theology here. We have the God from God, who is encountered in that temple, and he is Christ, the one filled with the Spirit. We have a Trinitarian theology right there. He has just admitted a Trinitarian theology, if only he has eyes to see it. But he is already assuming, his conclusion is that whatever mediator of the divine presence there is, it must be on the outside of his doctrine of God. He is assuming that. He's assuming his understanding from the outset. His conclusion is that whatever mediator there is, that mediator does not belong to the eternal life of God. That mediator must be in between the absolute God and the person experiencing God. But that is an assumption. He's beginning with his conclusion. It's dogma over data. He has dogma over data right here. That is why he is not seeing the biblical data correctly, because he has such thick Unitarian or perhaps tritheist lenses or perhaps atheist lenses. But he cannot understand this data because he has a prefabricated doctrine of God that won't allow the one in the temple who is named as Lord. He can't even allow him to be God. Well, if the God of Isaiah's temple vision is not God, then I don't know what doctrine of God Dan McClellan is wanting to defend.
So arriving at a different conclusion than yours is not begging the question. You have absolutely no evidence whatsoever that suggests I have presupposed anything whatsoever. And any careful reading of my book will demonstrate that I am not bringing anything remotely approximating a Unitarian or tritheistic or any other preconceived notion of God to these texts. And the fact that I've repeatedly pointed out that there are numerous different concepts of God in the text ought to have already demonstrated that. I don't care what idea of God the author presents. I just want to understand it. And I'm not saying Isaiah didn't say, I saw God. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying in the New Testament, when they talk about that, they are understanding Isaiah to have seen the pre-incarnate Jesus. You are projecting onto me the presupposition of univocality that you cannot escape, because you cannot even hold up the notion that these authors are not saying the exact same thing, even to criticize it. Even just trying to represent my argument in order to criticize it, you have to presuppose univocality on my behalf, which demonstrates the one who is looking at all of this blithely, obliviously, through profoundly dogmatic lenses. The hint is that it's the one who repeatedly said in the video that they look at this through specific dogmatic lenses, specifically the lenses of Jesus. That's what Glen has said here. And Glen has just laughably misunderstood and misrepresented me from beginning to end. And unfortunately, we're not even done yet.
But if you do want to defend a biblical doctrine of God, then you are involved in Trinitarian theology of necessity. The pre-incarnate Christ is God from God. The pre-incarnate Christ is the sent one of the Lord who is the Lord. That's what makes sense of the Old Testament. It's what makes sense of the New Testament, and it's what makes sense of Nicene Trinitarianism.
Why does that messenger of God get to do all the things that only God is supposed to be able to do? Well, according to Exodus 23, God explains, "My name is in him." And in John chapter 17, "You have given me your name." The author seems to be gesturing quite clearly in the direction of identifying Jesus as a mediatory figure who does what only God is supposed to be able to do and bears God's presence and power and authority.
As he has done in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. This is
Because Jesus is the authorized possessor of the divine name, that communicable vehicle of divine power and agency and presence.
And by prophesying to be the arbiter of final judgment and the one to grant forgiveness of sins and eternal life, Jesus takes to himself divine roles.
Yes, these are all things that the authorized possessor of the divine name can do within the Hebrew Bible, within Greco-Roman period, and even within rabbinic period Jewish literature.
Dan is used to going to Exodus chapter 23 and seeing how the angel of the Lord, this messenger of the Lord, possesses the divine name and has the power to forgive sins. But of course, this person is the Logos. That's who Philo took him to be. Philo, again and again, returns to Exodus 23 and says, "Oh, you know how I keep on talking about the Logos, who is the creator of all things? He is the high priest of all creation. He is the firstborn son. He is the sent one of the Lord, in whom the name and nature of God abides." Philo was saying it. Moses was saying it. Isaiah was saying it. John was saying it. And this is just what Trinitarian theology is. Once you recognize that this authorized possessor and carrier of the divine name is not external to what it is to be God. He is internal and eternal in the life of God.
So this doesn't actually engage my argument at all. This, again, just asserts things and preaches as a proxy for an argument.
So those are the 10 tricks of Dan McClellan. There is strawmanning, there is poisoning the well, there's disparaging the unity of Scripture, there's chronological snobbery, there's the halo effect, there is the appearance of neutrality, there is ABC, always be confident, there's misquote your interlocutor, there is ignore inconvenient points, and there is assume your conclusions. Do all this and you too can keep yourself safe from Trinitarian theology. But why take the risk? Don't keep yourself safe from Trinitarian theology. Instead, come to Jesus. He is the Son of the Father, filled with the Spirit. He is God from God, light from light, very God from very God. And when you come in on him, you come in on everything. That'll do us for now.
So I think this was a pretty pedestrian attempt to try to perform confidence, conviction, and competence for an audience that already agrees. At best, you got me that I am confident in my conclusions, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's just the outcome of critical thought and careful and long-term research. That's not a trick or a sleight of hand. You yourself committed multiple of these tricks and sleights of hand in the course of this video, but primarily you just used preaching and sermonizing as a proxy for an argument and just argued by assertion without engaging my concerns. And I don't know if you recall, but on Twitter, you told someone that I had declined an invitation to talk with you on your channel, and I chimed in to point out that, to be clear, I had not declined the invitation. I had asked for a rain check because I would be happy to come back. And you tried to get something on the schedule, and I said, I see you have posted a 70-minute video in response to me, so I'm going to need some time to get through that and then decide if I'm going to respond, and then we'll see. This is not a good faith engagement that you've provided in this video, and it does not fill me with confidence that you are capable of a good faith engagement. But I'm always happy to give folks a chance. So, Glen, if you can demonstrate that you can engage in good faith with my concerns with your video here, I will consider coming onto your channel and chatting with you. I can find room in my schedule in the next month or two, if that sounds good to you. But I need a demonstration of good faith from you. And I'm going to be honest, I don't have a lot of confidence. But I am always happy in that regard to be proven wrong. So Glen, prove me wrong. And the fit for this video has been Uncanny X-Men number 201.